Okay, well, welcome everybody this morning. Certainly it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Elena Masters here, and she's going to be talking about talking to terrorists, which I hope you don't take personally. I'm sure that it's not directed at you. But Dr. Masters is an expert in political psychology and intelligence and decision making, and she has done a lot of research on foreign sort of, terror groups like in Northern Ireland. Certainly she has worked in the Defense Intelligence Agency. She worked in a senior position in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. She has taught at the Naval War College, and she's currently Vice President and Dean of the School of Security and Global Studies at the American Military University. She is the author of several books, including Breaking Al-Qaeda, Political, Psychological, and Operational Techniques, and The Lesser Jihad, Recruits, and the Al-Qaeda Network. So without further ado, Dr. Masters.
Thanks. Well, thank you. Can everyone hear me on the microphone? Okay? Yeah? Okay. I want to thank everybody for coming out today, because with the weather I probably would have stayed home in my pajamas, to be quite honest. But I do appreciate it. It's nice to see so many people interested in this subject. It's been, my work since graduate school. I want to kind of take you on a timeline of how I got into this, where I went through the government, and how I ended up doing field work in Northern Ireland on armed groups. And actually, I'm heading there next week again to continue to do another study. It's been a really fascinating ride, and I got to tell you, in 1998, when I graduated from WSU, I would have never thought I'd be standing here today talking to you about this subject. My plan was to graduate, go into teaching, and sort of lead my academic life. But instead, my CV was passed to somebody in the Defense Intelligence Agency. And they were very, very interested. They were very innovative at that time, wanting to know, how do we understand the psychology of people, and, what can we do? And this was in terms of leadership. And so I'm going to be honest, I get this call, and I'm looking up, DIA, and where is it, and, what do they really do? And because it's not something that you think about all the time when you talk about intelligence. Everybody thinks CIA is the only thing out there, and that's not the case. I mean, there's so many different bodies doing intelligence. So I ended up getting the job, and you go through a pretty extensive clearance process. So I would say 9 months later, in June of 2001, and I note the year, I come in and I'm doing leadership analysis on people of interest to the Defense Department. Break, a couple of months later, 9/11 happens. And I'm standing in the building at the DIA, and we're watching the tower attacks. And then all of a sudden, out the window, there's an explosion at the Pentagon, and the plane had gone into the Pentagon. And we were right across the way. And you can imagine the kind of panic that was felt. At first, the military came in, because we were on a military base, and locked down the building, wouldn't let anybody leave. Then they decided, and then you can imagine panic, because planes are flying into buildings and nobody could leave. And then they let people out, and people fled. And I just decided to stay, knowing that there's no way that you can get out of the area and get home. You would be a sitting duck on the highway, was my perspective at that time. So we stayed, and things unfolded. And it's interesting, because Martha and I were talking this morning about the way that news unfolds, and especially with this Boston incident, a lot of how misinformation gets out there. And so we're being told there's bombings at the State Department, and all sorts of things are going on that really weren't happening. So I want to kind of set the tone for that, because you can imagine the threat and panic that goes through, that I'm sure every one of us has felt, during these times. The uncertainty, the who did this, who are these people? So the next day we all go back to work, and the game has changed, okay? And nobody in my division that does any kind of psychological analysis has any background in terrorism. So I get pulled into my boss's office. You're the lead. Figure it out. And I really had to figure it out. and figure out what I was going to do, you know, what we should be looking at. In the meantime, we get a visit from the counterterrorism people because, again, we're not attached to counterterrorism. I'm simply doing terrorism in another area. They have no idea how to study any of these guys. Okay, so there's this list from Special Operations Command. We need to know about X. And this was going to be very typical for the next 4 years for me when I was working, because they'd come up with a list and they'd say, I need to know about these guys. Tell us everything you want to know. How can we help lead to their capture? You know, what do we want to know? And so we got assigned all of it. And you can imagine the ops tempo of that constant churn and stress every single day because they needed to know. And so that's kind of how I got into the whole, you know, let's do the profiles of members of these terrorist groups. And I got to know them very, very well. I mean, intimately, in fact. And, you know, a lot of them were captured, so we got to look at whether or not our assessments were spot on by what they were saying, where we needed to adjust how we did things. You know, so it was a really interesting time in terms of academics. You know, what did I learn and what can apply and what do I need to adjust and learn other things. Then I got the dreaded, come into my office, I need you to go to this meeting at the Pentagon. It's like drawing the short straw because nobody wants to go to the Pentagon and have a meeting. Okay, so I go over and this really, really nice lieutenant colonel, he's now a 1-star, he said, you know, we got to do something about these madrasas. What about these madrasas? Now, he's also the lead on information operations, so it's not kinetic. Information operations is using information to influence surroundings, but he's focused on these buildings, you know. And I said, well, don't you really want to know why they did it? I mean, isn't that the question? We need to know why. I mean, and I know that everybody's really focused on interrogations and knowing when the next attack will happen and, you know, what they did, but we need to understand why this is. He's like, oh, that's a good idea. Why don't you take that on? So back I go to my boss and I said, well, I guess I have a standing date at the Pentagon once a week to give a briefing. And at this time, Gitmo was filling up Guantanamo Bay. So you can imagine the rich data that you can collect on this subject. But no one was doing it because interrogators were focused on other things. So that parlayed into me saying, well, I think we really need to start doing these collections plans for Guantanamo Bay. And other interrogators out there talking to terrorists to say, ask these specific questions. And this is how you ask them, and this is why you should ask them. We need to know these particular things. Because combating terrorism in the long run, you need to know the why. You know, and so that was a very, very challenging time because people had their ways of doing things, you know, and a lot of the ways that, again, they just wanted to get that guy who's going to tell them when the next attack is going to be. So this went on for several years. And I love to tell this interesting story about Gitmo because when I went down there, we were observing somebody. And he was an Egyptian. And I have to talk in very general terms here, but they were intaking him, they were debriefing him on, you know, where'd you come from, what's your timeline, that kind of thing. And we're standing there, and I'm like, yeah, you know, he sounds very much like Al-Qaeda. There was another intelligence person from another country there. He said, just let the guy go. He's nothing. And then there was a third analyst from DIA was saying, I just feel so sorry for him. And you do have to have that empathy, right? But that was her conclusion was, let him go. I feel sorry for this guy. He shouldn't even be here. Well, it turns out he was Al-Qaeda. And the reason, the learning moment there was I knew a lot about Egypt and the Egyptian groups. And from what he was saying in his timelines, although they talk around the subject, it was very clear that this guy didn't just end up at this place out of happenstance, looking for a job. And so that's the other real learning moment is if you want to interview people, particularly people in armed groups, you have to have the background and knowledge. Because going in cold, like many people would do, doesn't really give you that clear understanding and able to really understand, you know, where this person is and why they did what they were doing. So that was a big learning moment for many people. So we continued on this process of me going to the Pentagon every week. In the meantime, Special Operations Command is sending up their 100 guys I need to know about tomorrow. And we're doing all of this with a team. And then it was me, and then it was my team, and just kept growing, growing, growing. More people we were hiring, trying to train them in psychological analysis, and at the same time trying to keep up with all these taskings. And I have to say that teaching people was a very difficult thing as well, because if you're not trained in it, or you're not used to it, and you're not used to thinking that way, it becomes hard, especially when a high ops tempo environment, to kind of get people to think and focus on these kinds of variables and attributes, that we're looking at. So this went on for many, many years. And then after I left DIA, I actually went over to the Middle East office, and then changed positions to the Office of Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, and did something different there. But after that, going to the Naval War College, I needed a kind of a break. It was just this constant churn and stress all the time, and I wanted to go back to teaching. And so this opportunity came up at the Naval War College, and I went there, and this is where I started my research in Northern Ireland. And I have to say that all the things that I learned in the government about it was, again, a learning process, right? It took several years to learn how to do it right, to understand how you get people to talk to you, why they want to talk to you. And I had several opportunities to talk to them myself and sit down and have these conversations with people who were in these armed groups. So going to Northern Ireland was a whole different thing, because I didn't have any constraints, right? I didn't have the government saying to me, well, you can't go there, and you can't go here, and you can't do this. I got to do whatever I wanted. So landing in Northern Ireland, I wanted to study these armed groups on the Protestant side. And they're very little studied, and not a lot of people get to talk to these guys, sort of gain their trust. And at one, I had interviewed all sorts of other people who knew about them, or had information. And then one day, a woman that I met said, "Hey, do you want to meet the brigadier of this group, the Ulster Defence Association?" And there's 5 brigadiers, and they kind of parse out Northern Ireland amongst themselves, and they lead their respective people in the organization. I said, "Oh, that's great." So I'm sitting across from this guy. He's like, these Catholics, and they're out to get us, and it's the first time I'm seeing like this complete continuing threat perception in Northern Ireland that was supposedly at peace, at least according to our policymakers here. And I said, well, this is kind of interesting. Second lesson of learning about talking to individuals in armed groups: you have to show some kind of empathy without agreeing with them. Because this leads to maybe the third lesson is, rapport building is key. You can't force somebody to talk to you. You can't bang it out of them. You can't torture them to do it. But if you establish a rapport, you will get a lot of information out of people. And that's something that I will live and die by, that this is what you have to do. And it is hard. It is very hard to get to that point where you have those skills, knowledge, and abilities to be able to establish a rapport with somebody and then get them talking to you as if you're their best friend. And so I decided after that, well, these guys are kind of interesting, and they haven't laid down their arms, and maybe I'll just take a look at them, because I was going to look at somebody else. The only way to really do this was to establish connections. And how do you do this? You can't call them up, and so I walked into a bar in a paramilitary area. I was like, and I'm by myself, by the way, so this is much scarier than my controlled, nice setting of DIA, and talking to people. I walk in, and the first time I did that, I was so nervous, because I'm like, oh my God, I'm by myself. I'm in a paramilitary area. Everything's red, white, and blue with the flag, and it's all about these murals. And the bartender was a really, really friendly guy, who I actually ended up every time I went back bringing him a present, because he was just a really, kind of made things at ease in the bar. He said, oh, there's an American over there across the way. why don't you talk to him? I said, oh, okay, well, so I went over and I talked to him, and it turns out he visits every year his buddies, his paramilitary buddies. I guess he kind of just hooked up with them at some point. And he's not part of the organization, he's just, I guess, a fan, part of their fan club. And so from there I started talking to all these guys and meeting, the guy who planted the bomb, the guy who was the shooter, the guy who did this, guy who did that. And it was just one conversation after another, and I learned so much. And then I would meet the other brigadiers, because I'd, say, okay, well, I got the brigadier's phone number, this other guy, so I'll just call him up. And I went to see him every time I went. I'd be like, hey, how's it going? Just checking in, see how you're doing. We'd have these, hour-long conversations about stuff. And then, it just kind of ballooned from there. And so now I do it with a lot of different groups. Last time I went, we were on the Irish side, talking to the Irish National Liberation Army, their political party, and they've laid down their arms, but you still get that really good understanding about why they did it. How do we change things? Are things going to change given threat perceptions there, and people still harboring a lot of hatred from the past. So so I don't want to go on too long, but I want to kind of just give you a idea about how I sort of started on one end and sort of just took this on to a whole different level on my own, which has been very, very fun and rewarding for me, to be able to talk to people on that level, to understand things so much better than I would have just reading it in a book. So with that, I kind of leave it open to questions or things you want to talk about. Sure.
Did you have you through your career talked to many women, and if so, how is that the same, different, totally not what you expected compared to speaking with men?
There's no women at Guantanamo or in any other place, so no. There are a lot of women who are in support roles in certain organizations, and so I've interacted with a lot of them. But never, the only organization that I would say they play a really active role would be the IRA, and they're a very closed organization, very difficult to talk to anybody there. So the answer to your question is no.
When you're building rapport and talking to people in an informal situation like in a bar, when you're doing research or writing a book, what do you present yourself as? As I'm writing a book, or I'm doing research for this university, or?
No, I tell them I'm a professor from Naval War College, and I'm here doing some research and talking to people, and I would be pretty open with them. Like, I just talked to your brigadier a couple days ago, so I'm cleared with him. Don't worry. And most of them, it's weird. You feel like they become your friend, which is kind of frightening, in the sense that they kind of take you in, and they really just sort of tell you. And then I would say, again, I'm a professor, so all this stuff you're telling me, but a lot of times I never ask them direct questions. They kind of just talk to me about stuff. And I don't use it, actually, in my publications, unless it's been a formalized setting where we sit down and said, this is an interview, this is what we're talking. A lot of it is just building knowledge and understanding and background of what's going on. So.
This may be a little off track talk experience, but question, how do you identify these guys like Boston bombers? Apparently, so far at least, have no obvious indication threat.
Well, and that's a great question. It's extremely difficult, and we are very focused on profiling. And my perspective has always been that motivations is what I learned from the captive audience that we had and all the research that I did that I was documenting for the government. That everybody's got a different motivation, and so and when it's personalized or there's some issue going on, like somebody got divorced and therefore they joined some armed group, it's really difficult to predict anything or to look at people and say you're the guy who's going to turn in. And then what everyone keeps saying is they're so normal, and they are. So, that guy next door, I played ball with him, or I did this, and you hear it time and time again. So it's a difficult job. I mean, law enforcement's got a tough, tough job in this country.
When you were talking with that Egyptian guy who you were trying to identify as Al-Qaeda, how does someone sound like a group? Because, that kind of seems like, it's kind of like what his question was. Like, how do you identify someone as sounding like a group? Do they just have like the same frame of mind? Do you guys have to identify with that, or what?
Oh, okay, yeah, that's a good question. All right, so, again, appearing very normal, like your grandfather sitting there talking to you, okay? But the story is what is key, okay? So I went from, I lived in Egypt, and then, this happened, and then I decided to move to Bosnia or wherever, And then you start following the story, and you're like, hey, no, that does not make sense. They have done it, but it doesn't make sense that you would be some ordinary guy probably following this path. And knowing how the Egyptians migrated, right? So when the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and the Islamic group were thrown out of Egypt or rounded up, and where people fled, and where other elements of extremism were showing up around the country, that's kind of how you figure it out. But again, extensive background knowledge. You have to come in knowing these things to figure them out. Oh, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
One, with having studied terrorism in Egypt and Northern Ireland and other parts of the world, would you say there's a common element, something that all people that you have studied have in common, maybe a reason, like a psychological reason for their acts? And two, would you say that with any kind of reactions we have to terrorism, that we play into any of their goals?
Well, in answer to your first question, I see motivations all over the place. I would say that in the population that I studied, personal reasons were the most pervasive in why people joined. But then there's social, economic, political, and some psychological as in terms of depression. So it's all over the place, and so you can't establish a profile of somebody because it's not going to help you. I mean, you can have some ideas about why people do it. In your second question, you have to explain to me what you mean, U.S. policy or?
Well, say like terrorists target small groups in order to send a message aimed at larger groups, like society in general. Mm-hmm. Would you say that by displaying these attacks over media that we're playing into the public what they want, we're giving them what they want because they get more publicity?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we're, the thing about it is, if you even look at Al-Qaeda or branches of Al-Qaeda, or Hezbollah, or, even the IRA at their heyday, the propaganda machine is amazing. Like, that in itself is fascinating to me. And their media efforts are so great that we can't combat it. And so by us putting them, for prime time, they're simply getting just more playtime. So. But I don't think that's anything we can do about or control, Okay.
So say when you're getting to know these terrorist groups and you're on friendly basis, you have their names, their numbers, were you ever contacted by a national government to know who you are and what you're doing?
We're on tape here, so. When we shut the tape off, we can talk later. Do you have a question? Okay.
So when you are talking with these contacts in an uncontrolled environment, like in a bar or something, did you ever have any of them become less? Did any of them become hostile, and how did you respond?
Okay, that's a very good question, because, like I said, when you work for the government, things are very controlled. When you're out on your own, especially a woman on her own. Some of the things I did, I can't even believe I did them, but there are some very paranoid people in organizations. And that's good. That's the way they should be. They're closed, armed groups. And there's been a lot of times where people have said, what are you, a reporter? They were more concerned actually about me being a reporter than anything, or, what are you doing? Or, a lot of just paranoid people. Or are you a Catholic? I got that a lot of times, and then you try to explain to them you're not, and they only understand the two religions, Catholic, Protestant, that's it. So, yeah, it's been there have been times where it's been pretty scary. And you just got to kind of de-escalate the situation,
Does the profile in general have a lot of traits of psychopathy?
No. Across the board, studies have shown that terrorists are very, very normal people. Yep. And the reason is, too, that you can't have somebody crazy in your organization. It's too threatening, And that's not to say a guy gets in every once in a while, right? So that's got some kind of psychopathy. But, no, on the whole, as normal as you and me.
I've read articles that indicate not only are American troops coming back to KFTV, but that like in Afghanistan, there are people in Al-Qaeda that are really crazy, that they're associates, that they really don't know. But the environment, the violence, extreme violence, is causing significant numbers of people to go back. And I wonder if that's comment on it's a two-way street.
It is. It is. And I would agree with you on that it's creating, but some of these guys are very seasoned, right? So they go from one jihad to the other, right? So the original guys in Afghanistan were the people who fought in Algeria or fought in other places, right? The second generation of people have come through, and they're finding out, a lot of them are finding out that it wasn't as glorious as they thought it would be. I'm sure there's a lot of stress-related stuff being, in combat on their side as well, as you point out with our troops as well. So the other thing I would say, and this is interesting, and this is the next study I think I'm going to do with one of my colleagues, is the predator, psychological effects of predator drones. Because now and more you're seeing reports like, and then I hear the buzzing, and we know it's coming, but we don't know where it's going to be. And that effect on populations is significant, psychologically, so.
Do you ever see like an end to armed groups and acts of terrorism?
No, because people will always have something to fight over. So I'll be in business for a long time.
Given the fact that these groups are kind of closed and, but yet willing to talk to his bar, right? And kind of surprising, maybe what you might call surprising openness, willing to be friendly. Does that tell us anything about these actors and their motivations and what they want? What they think kind of important, other than that they like to talk?
Yeah, that's, like I said, I think a lot of them are so ordinary and their motivations are so ordinary, but they exist, especially in Northern Ireland. And I understand this completely, that they are under such high threat. That they perceive that Sinn Féin and the IRA, and now its prominence in the parliament, has really, is a huge threat to them. And they believe that the war is still on, at least in their minds, But at the same time, they've laid down their arms. Now, in a general sense, but they're still involved in criminal activity and all these other things. So I think you're seeing now a lot of mixed motivation. I was part of this armed group, but now I get to, parlay this into illegal activities, but I still have this weird threat perception out there, and at any time I'm going to go back to the war. So it's just so complicated, the way that they are and their psyche. And a lot of them, I had this really heart-wrenching conversation with one who he's psychologically just messed up from the whole thing, about what he did during the war, how the people that he killed, And he was just so depressed. And he said, but I can't get help. I'm not going to go get help because, I'm a man and we don't go to psychologists. So, I mean, it's just sad, the after effects that a war will bring. Go ahead.
So is there grievances that these groups have for them to accept that the U.S. or the Catholics are not after them? What does it take to understand that they're not getting correctly?
Okay, well, the question is about identity, right? So the Irish identity versus the British identity. Okay, so at the end of 1998, they decided that, Northern Ireland was going to remain part of the United Kingdom. So in their view, the British finally admitted, yes, Northern Ireland is part of the UK and everything's fine. But they stand up this parliament, this local parliament, where Sinn Féin, which is the IRA's political party, has dominance over, okay? And they're, now they've got the money, they've got the support, they've got government funds, they're cleaning up their areas, things are looking good, they're like the rising middle class, so what they started out as more poverty-stricken than the Protestants are now moving up, upward mobility. And then this interesting thing, which is why I'm going next week, is City Hall in Belfast decided that they were going to limit the flying of the Union Jack, the British flag, over the City Hall, unlimited days. So riots break out, paramilitaries come out. The police are dealing with, a crazy resurgence of violence, all because the Union Jack is going to be flown just a couple days a week. This is how important identity is. How do you get beyond that? You have to foster an identity that's different from the two that they're staunchly committed to. And any kind of experiments to try to do that, for example, they have an alliance party that, says, we're not British, we're not Irish, we're all just, part of Northern Ireland, has no support. So I would say that wounds are long-standing and festering, Yeah, that's you make a great point. Yes. What's happening, especially in these areas where the paramilitaries still control, right? I don't want to call them paramilitaries, they're armed groups. They still control, is you're seeing generation after generation after generation, a lot of youth on youth violence, especially in interface areas, carrying on sort of the thoughts of their parents. That's really difficult to undo. So it's going to be continuing to be a problem. There are people, and there's a lot of people that are just like, let's get this over with. Where you're seeing it, though, is more of the working class areas and the interface areas,
Question, what are your thoughts on the psychological effects of decapitation strategy against environment groups?
Which psychological effects on whom?
On the group itself.
This is a good question because that kind of violence, that people tend to do things in groups that they wouldn't ordinarily do on their own, and I think then it becomes an accepted practice, to be able to do that, and you have so dehumanized your enemy that it's fine, cut off their head, And that's not the first, we see this a lot in the Al-Qaeda-related groups, but it was happening in Northern Ireland as well. They had the Shankill butchers, went out on killing sprees, chopping off Catholics' heads, putting them in romper rooms and killing them, what they called romper rooms, where they all spectated and people were killed. So, it's not new practice, it's just all part of, I think, dehumanization. So.
Hi, not comes up there. What do you think, and I'm not sure if this is this question or this is a follow-on, but what about the psychological effect of decapitation for leadership in terms of an organizational structure?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you meant literally.
Actually, I like that.
Okay, that's a good point. You know how I roll my eyes at this one because it's always like, we just need to cut off the head of the snake. What does that mean? You know, I mean, does a snake have multiple heads or not, or it's just one snake? As long as there's succession planning in the organization will be fine. You know, but if there's a leader that has such undue influence on the group, then the group is kind of screwed. You know, so it just depends. I would say something like Hezbollah is going to have a problem with succession planning with Nasrallah. You know, especially because he's so charismatic and he's so powerful and controlling. You know, but other groups, like even Al-Qaeda in Yemen, you know, in the Arabian Peninsula, they seem to just, you know, let's pick up the next guy and move on. You know, so it just depends.
Have you noticed a impact on group communication or organization through social media?
Oh yeah, fascinating stuff. I mean, it's just, for example, I'll give you an example. In Northern Ireland, this is how we're finding out where the riots are going to take place, because in social media they're all communicating with each other, going, "Meet here. We're going to have this thing, you know, today," and they're all kind of gearing up to go to these, you know, areas. So, I mean, that's how we're going to basically be able to talk to the protesters and stuff, is to be able to follow that. Social media, I mean, is being used. Twitter, I mean, it's just it's whatever we would think of doing, they will do it, you know.
What do you think about the psychological impact within the group when the group turns to using more suicide terrorism?
Well, that's an interesting thing, because you know, I have a lot of thoughts on suicide, and I'm not an expert on the suicide terrorism stuff, but you know, when you start asking people to do things, like say with jihadis, for example, you know, a lot of the Saudis were coming over in droves, you know, and from what people were telling me, you know, not everybody wants to kill themselves, okay, and so they're just like, dude, I'm checking the box, just going over doing my jihad and going back home, get married, okay. They got very, very upset at being asked to kill themselves, okay. Then there's other people who, and I believe people who kill themselves want an out in some way or other, with depression, and that's my personal view, you know, that if you got to that point where you want to kill yourself, you're looking for something, you're looking for a way to do it. There's other things where they put them into extreme, you know, they isolate them, and I've talked to some of these guys and read some of the reports on this. Very interesting. Well, Al-Qaeda was separating them and putting them into these, you know, massive indoctrination things. And yet still, on some of them it didn't work, you know, so I think it just depends on the motivation of the individual. Okay.
When I was in university in Northern Ireland back in the mid 80s, it seemed that the unionist groups like UDA, the UDF, and often with the collusion of the British Army kind of acted with impunity, and you know, that was associated with the Orange Marches, and it strikes me that with the riots over the flag flying on Belfast City Hall, that there seems to be an element of the unionist groups feeling somewhat cornered, or at least under threat from their previous original position. How do you think that's going to unfold? Then I'm specifically thinking, we're going to see a kind of turn of the tables where they're more in the situation, say the IRA or the IRA was, you know, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, or is there going to be a resurgence? Are they going to adopt maybe, in your understanding, maybe more extreme tactics than they're already doing? Because I think what most people may not know here is that Northern Ireland is a super safe place in terms of crime. It has the same level of crime roughly as Japan. It's super safe, except when it does happen, it's kind of nasty.
Right.
So I wonder how you see that.
Well, you know, that's a good question. I think if they don't figure it out, it's going to get worse, because of the prominence of Sinn Féin, and because the social economic situation has really exacerbated things. You know, I have friends in Protestant areas, depressed areas, and I mean friends, not my, you know, UDA guys, but the actual friends, and telling me how bleak it is, you know, and how these guys have never worked anyway, and so now their benefits are being cut. Everybody's looking for, you know, someone to blame. And Sinn Féin, the perception is, rightly or wrongly, that they've got all the money. And now we've got the city hall thing, which is just, people just check the block. See, it's another reason why. I think with all the rioting that are taking place in the interface areas, I mean, it's just, I think you're going to see a lot of internecine violence. I really do.
What would you offer up as a solution to the Rhode Island?
It's hard. I mean, like I said, I think they got to foster another identity, and that's pie in the sky at this point. I don't know how you get people to stop being threatened, especially when, like I said, they're checking the box. Every time something happens, or anytime legislation is passed, it's seen as pro or anti, or, it's just very hard to get people out of the mindset. Like I said, there's loads of people who don't have a problem, but it's where the festering situation is in certain areas that are still controlled by armed groups that is a problem.
Do you see a problem that Northern Ireland predominantly identifies as also a British citizen, so they already have that strong identity?
Right.
They're Irish, regardless of what side of the border they're from. They already have a very, very strong personal identity that they've formed over the last 700 years, so they're not going to form another one that's, again, separate.
Right, you're asking me to not be an American anymore or something, I mean, can you imagine someone saying, no, I don't want you to be an American anymore, I want you to be Mexican. How about that? So it's just very hard on people. This is who they are,
What role are these people, generally speaking, well educated or not educated? What role does education play in, I'm thinking of this question, kind of de-escalating that violence as a solution?
You're talking, well, I would say across the board, it's a misnomer that people are uneducated or poor, and that's why they join an armed group, especially amongst leadership. But education can play a role in the sense that you have to have mixed education, and you have to get people to work and interact with others from other communities to see them as human rather than inhuman. But they create their own barriers as well. Hezbollah has got its own system of education in Lebanon. They've got their own healthcare system. They've got their own mosques. And so everything they do is controlling the Shia population, right? So as to create this in-group, at the expense of all the other groups. So it's a difficult prospect,
Expanding on the predator drum war more, have you personally noticed, has it had an effect, like it's instilled more fear into the tribal people and they're starting to push out militants, or would you say that it's maybe uniting them and creating like a common enemy in the Americans?
Well, the tribal thing, I mean, Martha's more of an expert on this than I am, but the bags of money approach, that it's really just, I say that, where the loyalties, well, first there's the hospitality issue, right? Where we're good hosts, that we're going to keep our people. Then there's the, well, I don't know, what can you do for me that will make things better for me so I can turn this guy in. And changing allegiances. Okay, so this is happening all over in Afghanistan, Pakistan, other areas, Iraq. So it's so complicated that I would say it's more cyclical, right? So one day they may expel the guy, the next day they may take other people in, depending on whether or not the government did something for them they didn't like, or someone handed them a bag of cash. I don't know, And I would say the worst effect, again, with predators is the effect on the populations, the psychological effect of being under that threat.
Do you view homegrown terrorism within the United States to become an increasing problem within the coming years?
it's hard to. It's just hard to say what's going to radicalize people and who's going to do it. I mean, it's such a small issue in terms of Islamist groups, but I would say we have a much bigger problem with militias than anything. You know, militias and other right-wing groups. So we spend an awful lot of time worrying about that, Muslim groups, and we don't spend enough time actually thinking about the other issues we have in this country.
So do you have a list of do's and don'ts in U.S. policy and
That's a loaded question. You know, no matter what we do, we're not going to do it right. No matter what Israel does, it's not going to do it right. And so someone's going to hate us for doing one thing and hate us for not doing another. And so, you know, while we can disagree with a lot of policies and know that they probably, you know, for example, I'll give you a good example. Going to Iraq, disaster, right? Because you created a whole bunch of new people who hated us, you know, from a counterterrorism perspective. You know, I thought it was disastrous. Al-Qaeda in Iraq stood up, all this other stuff started happening. So, you know, there's just good and bad, and again, no matter what we do nowadays, it may be some populations may see it good and others just will hate us.
This is maybe a bit more of a personal question, so feel free to pass it by, but how do you find people react to your job? Like, you just tell somebody you meet in a coffee shop, like, oh yeah, I work with terrorists. What?
Yeah, people are shocked, especially women. Really shocked. Because, you know, it's security-related fields are very male-dominated, right? And so there was at the beginning, very few of us doing any kind of stuff. And also people thought that women couldn't do it right or well because of the nature of these groups and how we couldn't sit down with men from Muslim countries and talk to them, you know? But again, that goes back to my whole point about rapport building. It is about building rapport. And if you're good at it, you know, some may say, no, absolutely, I don't want to be in a room with women. And others will say, you know what, she sat down and talked with me and, you know, I appreciate that. So it depends. We can talk more offline about the challenges.
You've kind of discussed in general about about how people tend to believe in the kind of roots of terrorism cause too much, you know, depending on thinking there's some psychopathy or it's poverty or lack of education. Have you found any kind of entrenched views with policymakers who maybe haven't been on the academic side that you find to be disruptive or not helpful to the current dialogue? I mean, do you still see people saying these things, even though now we have so much research from RAND and MIT and all those places that have shown that there's very, very low correlation?
Oh yeah, all the time. It's always in the press. Oh, these crazy people, you know, crazy. It's all crazy. And you can't, so if it's crazy, then you don't have to, you know, you have to throw your hands up and you don't have to actually address it.
Misnomers that you hear policymakers say about terrorism?
They're crazy. Well, Bush said it best, right? They're crazy. They hate our values. And what was his third thing? I can't remember what it was. But those, I mean, or the education thing. It's just because they're uneducated or they're poverty stricken. So I would say those kind of misnomers are very, very bad for thinking about how to create better policy.
And at what levels of policymaking do you hear those things? I mean, do you hear those things all the way up in the briefings, you know, the ones that are right before the one that goes to the president? I mean, how high do you hear those?
Well, I used to say that there's a lot of really thoughtful people because I did my stint in policy. There's a lot of really, really thoughtful people, smart people, people who want to do the right thing. And then there's the other people. It's like in any organization, though. You know, you're going to get the really black and white thinkers, and then you're going to get the shades of gray thinkers. Yep. All right. Well, thanks very much for coming. I appreciate it. And